So is different types of learning possible? For example, if I were to download a mathematics textbook into my mind, would that be easier than teaching me how to do Kung Fu?
Okay, in theory, yes. That might be easier. Because really I would say yes, because there's fewer parts involved in some sense, right? If you take a part as being the brain and the body, right? For mathematics, you're not talking about a physical activity that also needs to have intricate relationships between muscle movements and things like that. You're just talking about something in the brain. But it gets really complex because when we learn, it's not just like flipping a bit on a transistor in a computer or something like that. There's physical changes happening in the brain. A really great example is there's a study done on jugglers. And they had people learning how to juggle. And it turned out that there were physical changes after just like a week or two in the motor cortex of the brain became bigger and it became more interconnected. And so in the matrix, it's some kind of plug that plugs into the back, right? And what the impression that you get is that it's writing information somehow, like electrically writing information into the brain. Mm-hmm. Whereas what it would need to do is actually change the physical structure of the brain.
And would that be impossible?
Not theoretically impossible, right? It happens already naturally, biologically.
Just over time.
Right, just over time. So there might be, in theory, some way to speed that process up. But you know, at the end of the day, you can't build a bridge any faster than some minimum, right?
So what about storing information in the brain as opposed to using the brain? I guess the difference between using it as like a drive versus using it as an executable program. You know what I mean?
Right,
like, can we use it as a data storage center without actually accessing that information?
Memory in the brain is really tricky. So again, when you talk about memory on, say, a computer, it's stored in a place, and you can access that very easily. The memory in the brain doesn't seem like most of the research suggests that there isn't a neuron or group of neurons that encodes the memory of your mother, right? Because our memories are highly associative. And there's a lot of evidence that actually suggests that memory is actually just reliving an event, re-experiencing it. And so for example, if I think about moving my arm, just like the monkey, mm-hmm. right? The neurons in my motor cortex, that if I stimulate this part of your brain, which I can do really easily, non-invasively, if we walk down the street, I can do it for you. I can make this finger twitch or this finger twitch, because I can stimulate the neurons that connect to the muscles, send signals, I should say, to the muscles to make these fingers twitch or whatever. But if I imagine making those finger movements, that same group of neurons is active. Not as strongly, but a little bit. So imagining a movement activates the same group of neurons as actually making the movement. And by analogy, that sort of seems like what's happening in memory. By imagining or remembering an event, you're actually kind of reconstructing it in a lot of ways. So like a memory of your mother or my mother or something like that isn't just a person, right? You have experiences. So it's this really complicated thing. And so there's no one place where that happens.
So in the Matrix, of course, spoiler alert, there is a virtual world that people are living in, essentially built of their own minds. Is that something that we could ever plug into? Do you think that you could make some kind of virtual world in someone's mind that you wouldn't be able to tell the difference between the real world and reality?
Well, in some ways, that's kind of, it seems like what psychosis is, right? So people confuse their hallucinations for reality. So in some ways, that's already happening at a biological level, mm-hmm. right? And if it already can happen, that suggests that there's probably some process that we can manipulate to make it happen. The question is that even technologically feasible? So sure, in theory, that could happen, but you know, we don't even know, is there one thing known as psychosis, or is there like 1,000 different subtle variations of things that we give one lump term of psychosis to, mm-hmm. right? We're just not really sure. Now, you can start to get a little bit nitpicky and say that, you know, what is a virtual world? What is confusing a virtual world or an imagined world with the real world, right? And so one thing that you could say is that we already get very easily immersed, even in books, mm-hmm. right? Where if I'm really into a book, I'm kind of constructing this virtual world in my head. Again, going back to the idea of imagining the hand movement, I'm activating the neurons in my brain that represent that movement. Same thing happens in the visual parts of the brain. If I imagine imagine I'm reading a book and I'm reading, let's say, Game of Thrones, right? I'm imagining what the Red Keep looks like, right, at King's Landing. And in my brain, I see it. I see what that Red Keep looks like, right? Because I'm reading the words and I'm constructing this reality. And my visual cortex becomes active, right? And in some ways, I am living in a virtual world, right? The question is, can you amplify that to the point where I don't remember the difference between the real world and this imaginary world?
And can you trick the brain into thinking that you're eating something or smelling something or tasting something? Because I feel like all the different senses are they're coming from your mind, they're coming from the same place in the way that we're using that information. Can you trick all of those different parts of your brain to think that you are in a physical place?
Well, we're already tricking ourselves in a lot of ways, right? We think that there is a really strong mapping between our sensory information and reality. But we know that's not actually true, right? Even for something like vision, we've got the blind spot, right? So our eyes communicate with the brain via what's called the optic nerve. And the optic nerve leaves out of the back of the eye through a spot. And that spot where all those nerves are exiting into the brain, that's a spot where we don't have any photoreceptors. So the camera is blind in that spot, but we don't see a blind spot because we're filling in that missing information. And so the statistic I like to give is that for every one cable axon, it's called, that connects neurons to each other, or not physically connecting, but communicationally connecting neurons to each other. For every one axon that we have, one piece of information leaving our eye and sending information about the visual world back to our brain sends 10 onto itself at that same spot. So you could almost think of it as like every one bit of actual real information we're getting from the world around us, we're modulating that by a factor of 10, which is pretty incredible. You can do some really interesting experiments with that knowledge.
So say we could live in this virtual world, this computer simulated world in our mind. If we were actually downloading information like Kung Fu, like karate, would that be kind of tricking our brains into thinking we were acting them out and therefore downloading it in a better way than how we were talking about earlier? Like if your brain thinks it's doing the actions, is that triggering the same kind of memory responses, memory absorption that you would be doing if you were actually physically doing it?
Yes, with a lot of qualifiers.
This is very esoteric, I know.
So, I don't think I'm misremembering. I think the research suggests that.
Or are you? Or is
there's
it
no
all
way to know.
just
There's
a
no way to
trick?
know. I'm probably not even here right now. There's a study that was done, a couple of studies now, that show that if somebody lifts weights, then you get hypertrophy, you gain muscle mass. If somebody doesn't lift weights, you don't. Right? If somebody runs, you get better at running. You can run longer distances. Your endurance increases. If you don't run, your endurance doesn't increase. If you have people spend 20 minutes a day thinking about lifting weights, they actually do get a little bit stronger.
No way.
Totally
no
seriously.
No way. Really?
This, in theory, goes back to the idea of imagining a thing is a very faint echo of actually doing that thing.
What?
Yeah. And so
you're blowing my mind, Brad.
This is crazy. I know. This is why I love this kind of research, right? Because you delve into the research and you're like, no, that's not real. And then you find out it is, and you're like, what is going on? Why are humans so weird? And so, in theory, right, if you're living in some kind of virtualized world, the things that we are limited to experiences in real time. We can't do things faster than time flows, right? But if you're in a virtual world, you can manipulate the speed at which things happen. Right? So if you could somehow, let's say that the barrier of learning is this physical change in the brain. And these physical changes have some biologically limited time at which they need to occur. But if you're living in a virtual world and you speed up experiences, can you pack more experiences into the same unit time frame, right? So can you speed up the process? So it might not be instant, like he does in Oh, I Know Kung Fu, but maybe you could speed that process up. Again, this is all like really esoteric, like you said, kind of stuff, but I don't see any reason why that couldn't be the case, given what we know.
Okay, so I feel like I'm getting conflicting information, because on one hand, we can't just download a program that is going to teach us how to do something instantly like Neo. But on the other hand, if we watch something, or if we, like we were just talking about, if you are imagining doing something over and over and over, you may actually learn some of the, would it be incorrect to say muscle memory for that?
So muscle memory, I think, that's one of those popular terms that doesn't necessarily have a whole lot of scientific meaning, right?
Doesn't mean what we think it means.
Yeah, and that's such a weak thing to say, but I think it's true in this case, because muscle memory is, okay, going back to the juggling study I told you about, right? So you're juggling, and that's actually causing physical changes in the motor cortex of the brain, right? That's kind of what muscle memory is that it's strengthening of connections between the muscles and the communication between the body and the brain, right? I mean, the classic example is, so like I was telling you, we can do non-invasive brain stimulation. So I can use this device called a transcranial magnetic stimulator. It's this like wand thing. I press a button and it goes click, and it sends a little electrical field about the size of a dime or a penny I can stimulate of your brain using this device. And I can hit this finger versus this finger. And that's because the brain has a topography, so that the motor cortex, which is like somewhere, let's say around here, kind of goes like this. The muscles for your face are represented down here, and the muscles for your like upper arms and upper body are about here, and then the muscles for your stomach are about here, and then your legs. And so you can actually map the body onto the brain. And people who pianists, for example, they do a lot of fine finger movements. The part of their brain, the amount of spatial territory of their brain that represents their fingers, is much bigger than people who don't do a lot of fine manipulations.
Okay.
Right?
So it sounds like I can't download a program for Kung Fu, but if I sit and watch 10,000 hours of Kung Fu videos on YouTube, eventually my brain might kind of start figuring out the motions or know what to do better.
I would say no, not just passively sitting there and watching, right? The studies that were done where people were actually gaining some strength benefit were people sitting there actively thinking about lifting weights, right?
Okay.
So they're not passively just sitting there watching people weightlifting. They're actively sitting there thinking about people lifting weights, and therein lies the big difference, I think.
So if I think every day about actively doing 100 crunches, I may get a six-pack.
You would be better off just doing the 100 crunches.
Always looking for a shortcut.
Sorry. But if you could have somebody do that while sleeping, maybe. Who knows?
If they just play, okay, yeah. Gotcha. Is anyone trying to simulate the brain right now using computers?
Yeah, there's this guy, Henry Markram, who's a neuroscientist in the EU, and he actually just got $1 billion grant to simulate the brain. And so that's based off of the idea that it looked like for a long time that the brain is organized in what are called cortical columns. So the cortex, which means bark in Latin, it's the outer covering of the brain, neurons seem to be organized into these little groupings that they called columns. And we know a lot about the structure of a cortical column. And so this project is an attempt to say, okay, if we know that there's this column, and we know a lot about the structure and the neurons that make it up, and they're essentially replicated across the cortex, let's just do that. Let's just simulate that. And they're trying to go very low-level, basic biophysical, like, neurons communicate with each other by electricity, and that happens by ion channels opening and ions passing through and building up charge and sending this signal. Let's simulate all of that and replicate a brain-sized version of that. And that's really cool. And I've been critical of them because I think that there's a lot of problems with that. It makes too many assumptions. There's a paper that just came out that suggests that the brain isn't actually really organized into these columns in the way that we think. And there's a lot of evidence that suggests that communication doesn't happen quite the way we think, just by neurotransmitters. For example, nitric oxide, which is a gas, actually can diffuse far through the brain from one part to the other. It's not a chemical that passes across the synapse. It's a gas that passes along distances and can cause something to happen over here when it came over here, like centimeters away or something like that. But they're trying. And in theory, if they have the basics, all they need to do is continually tweaking and improving it, right? And I think that's kind of the thinking. And so I hope it works. I'm doubtful, but I really hope it works. That would be cool.
Are they trying to create artificial intelligence? Is that like one of the
That's not actually the
games?
goal,
No.
I don't think. They want to see if they can just simulate a brain.
Nice.
And if it happens to be artificially intelligent, yay. But
Bonus.
there's no guarantee.
Or maybe not, if they end up taking us down.
I mean, some of the criticisms are like, it's not going to go from not working to just working.
Right.
It's not going to be like, it's not a human, now it's a human. There's going to be sort of like broken intermediate stages But if there's some kind of semi-conscious intermediate stage, are you like ethically? Can you just turn that off?
Oh, that's so freaky.
Yeah. So there's this whole weird ethical conundrum involved with this too. But
so it's kind of hard to talk about this stuff without going into the singularity discussion, because in a way, if it were possible to download information into the brain, it could also perhaps be possible to export that information into some kind of holding vessel or into some kind of different, body or computer or, all-knowing kind of cloud in space where people hang out. I don't know. But is that kind of where that would go?
yeah. So
What is the thinking right now on that?
whoa, the thinking right now, I don't think a lot of academic neuroscientists aren't really thinking about that necessarily, right? There's some philosophical discussion on these kinds of topics, right? There's even the argument that we're all probably, statistically speaking, we're all probably really living in a simulation already. The argument goes, I'm trying to remember exactly how it goes. So the argument goes, we're becoming technologically advanced enough that we can create computer simulations of certain things, like even the game of life, right, which is just a little mathematical toy model. But let's say to do a real experiment, to do tons of manipulations, the real world is too constraining. So what we should be doing if we want to do a lot of experimenting is let's recreate a digital world, and then we can tweak some parameters in that digital world to experiment on it. Well, if we can do the technology to do that, let's say someday, 100 years down the line, we can do that, then that means that will probably happen, and we will create thousands of virtual worlds to experiment on. Which means if that's the case, then statistically speaking, we're probably actually already in one of those worlds.
Already in one of those.
Yeah.
If we were, why would we make such constraining physics on everything?
Well, that would be, so there's some
That would
other
be
world
one of
with
the-
slightly different parameters of physics to see what happens, right? We just happen to be in one where everything works out quite right. I think that's what the argument is. Now, what you're talking about on the actual neuroscience side of things, there's a great book series, Altered Carbon, talking about mind uploading, right, or body transfer. I forget exactly how he puts it. But the idea is that, well, if the brain is a computer, well, you can take all that information and put it somewhere else, right? And I think there's a little bit of wonkiness in the metaphor because the brain isn't a computer in the sense of like my laptop is a computer, right? It's a computer in the sense of how Turing meant what is a computational device, right? The brain computes information. It is a computer. It's not a computer as like a silicon bit flipping transistor-based kind of thing. But in theory, let's say if you're going to go all like, okay, let's talk about some singularity version of the world. We've got incredible nanotechnology and things like that. If learning is actually physical changes in the brain, then you could have some kind of nanobots that are like rebuilding the scaffolding on the fly very quickly, and they're shuttling around your brain and moving things around and learning for you. The problem is the amount of complexity. You can have a computable deterministic device that is so complex you can't predict one state from the previous, right? So therein lies the question: is the brain computable? It's a computer, but is it computable? Or is it too complex? And that's the problem.
It seems like it would be more of a snapshot in time rather
Right.
than the amalgamation of all your thoughts and feelings. Yeah.
I did like in Altered Carbon, he talks when people do the mind uploading to a new body, there's some period of time where it's incredibly disorienting because they've got different muscle sizes and body shapes and things like that. And so I really like that touch. That was really good.
Even just minute changes would be enough to totally throw you off for a little while.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of evidence that suggests that the communication between the viscera, our guts and things like that, actually has an effect on our perception and behavior. And so, if you have different heart size, or whatever, then subtle changes like that would have effects on how we perceive and act.
Well, I could talk about this all day, all week, for that matter.
I could talk about it forever.
You talk about it all the time, yeah.
This is my job.
It's extremely fascinating. So just to kind of wrap things up, though, do you think that it would be possible? So I'm guessing from what we've discussed that the way that information is downloaded in a film like The Matrix would not be possible for us as humans to kind of use as a learning tool.
There are ways we can modify, for certain, there are ways that we can modify, speed up learning process given what we know about the brain. I don't think we're anywhere near doing something like The Matrix, and it's actually an outstanding question as to whether that's even possible, going back to the computation idea. But there's certainly ways that we can modify.
I almost kind of want to give it a plausible then. Like I don't want to cut it off at fictional, because it sounds like, hey, if I can think about lifting weights all day and eventually maybe I get even just the most minute, tiny little change in my physiology, in my physical state, that's pretty interesting.
I try not to talk in absolutes. I don't want to be the guy that comes on and says this isn't possible, and then tomorrow somebody figures it out, and I'm the dumbass that was like. So, not talking in absolutes. It's not statistically impossible.
It's not statistically impossible. All right, great. Thank you so much,
Thanks,
Brad.
Veronica. I really appreciate it.